evening, and welcome to Counterculture with Danielle D'Souza-Gill. The culture's gone crazy, media's gone mad, and reason has become repugnant. Here we focus on facts and how to fight back. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the importance of Israel. It's been years, perhaps even decades, since the American news media could claim to be even marginally trustworthy. In 2018, polls showed 72% of Americans believed that news sources knowingly report information they believe to be misleading or outright false. In 2020, 66% believed the media was either not very trustworthy or completely untrustworthy. In February, a poll found that half of Americans believed the media deliberately lied in their reporting, and 52% said that they thought the media did not care about what was in the best interest of their audiences. It doesn't matter if the polling is done by Gallup, Rasmussen, or Pew. The results all show the same general phenomenon, all following the same trend lines. And wait until these polling outfits finally start asking people if news sources are trying to intentionally harm or even inflict death on their audiences. Generally speaking, the mainline news sources all share this reputation, regardless of political ideology, as even conservative news outlets fall under some of the same corporate media umbrellas as the other outlets. Most people who are even moderately attentive to the news have at least a general sense that everything has to be taken with a grain of salt. You can't just listen and believe immediately what you say. The more savvy have researched the connections between media, corporations, and government to the point where they see the media's operational hierarchy. For example, the New York Times functions as a stealth clearinghouse for lies from Main Justice in D.C., while the Washington Post is the mouthpiece of the Department of State and domestic influence operations of the CIA. This knowledge helps to filter and contextualize the stories of the day. Once you know the agenda, you start to see the fuller story the news doesn't want you to see. It takes a lot of time and attention to attain this level of understanding. Counterculture has and will continue to devote entire episodes to exposing this morass of corruption. When it comes to news from other countries, however, these same rules may not necessarily apply. Factors such as different governments, different degrees of corporate influence, and different levels of bureaucratic capture make understanding world affairs much more murky. Even though concepts of right versus left, conservative versus liberal are one and the same, they can be a bit different from country to country, and they have started to lose all meaning, even in our own country, where there are cues and hints for understanding reporting on world events. We have the very nature of oppressors to thank for this. If you're in downtown Osaka and you go into a food joint with a familiar pair of golden arches out front, you know with absolute certainty that the quality and taste of a McDonald's cheeseburger and fries purchased there will be exactly the same as it would be if you made the same purchase in San Bernardino, California. McDonald's is a global corporation, and so its global branding is consistent. In the very same manner, then, the globalist cabal relies on shared resources, tips, and tactics in New York City and Tel Aviv alike. You may have heard of the protests going on in Israel over proposed changes and how the parliament controls that nation's Supreme Court. Proponents say it's a necessary move to make unelected bureaucrats more accountable. Opponents caution that it gives the majority the ability to run roughshod over the minority by summarily overturning rulings that protect their rights. As an American conservative in the year 2023, it's hard to know who's right. On the one hand, judicial tyranny is very much a thing here. We have unelected judges playing along with DOJ narratives to destroy the lives of political rivals, be they politician, protester, or parent. On the other hand, opponents also seem to have a point. Majority influence over Supreme Court rulings sounds very much like the type of consolidation of power the three branches of government are designed to prevent. But if you look at the protesters, you start to see some interesting similarities between the Israeli opponents and our own astroturfed BLM and Antifa here in the United States. Aside from the fact that the protesters are comprised of a fair number of gullible and easily misled college-aged people, the demonstrations have a curious mix of handmade signs and high-end banners that would have been very expensive to produce. You may remember how leftist protesters in the U.S. would pretend to gather organically. only for everyone to be waving around the same mass-produced sign and placard, a clear indicator that the organizers were well-funded. Take this image from Bloomberg, for example. You see the handmade signs, but partially cut off at the bottom is a large all-weather banner with photographics and high-contrast large font lettering. Not exactly the type of thing one produces with a flap of cardboard and oversized Sharpies. Or how about the enormous banner seen in this aerial capture of the protests? Take a look. The image is the raised fist that was commonly seen in BLM and Antifa protests here in the States. What's it doing in Israel? This image has a long pedigree with socialist and communist movements which have a genocidal relationship to Jews historically. Isn't that odd? Again, it's not the kind of thing that can be produced by a circle of Jewish grandmothers. It had to be designed, commissioned, and produced, and at considerable cost. You can't simply sew this at home. Or how about this banner? It looks to be about 40 feet long and uses blood-red imagery to compare Netanyahu with Putin and the Ayatollah. Imagine how many ink cartridges were needed to make that. Other hallmarks of movements operated by globalist oppressors are also present. We have the pink shirts and pride flags that paved the way for our current secular tyranny through the exploitation of sex and gender issues. But perhaps nothing gives the game away more than the protesters wearing the familiar red dresses and white bonnets from Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. This popular North American iconography is normally reserved for pro-abortion protests here in the States. The book's futuristic dystopian New England setting has about as much applicability to Israel as Thanksgiving dinner does to Korea. But for some reason, its following is cult among globalists who are starved for narratives that are remotely close to painting their ideology as rebellious. And so it ends up becoming WEF shorthand for characterizing any threat to their march towards global feudalism as oppressive. They can't help themselves. Their narrow ideology has pride flags on the one side and handmaidens on the other, with about 3 inches of intellectual freedom in between the two. The idea of shared resources and imagery goes hand in hand with the globalist project of erasing borders, languages, and cultures under an oppressive one-world government. This explains why the U.S. Supreme Court Dobbs decision produced a worldwide backlash against abortion restrictions. One of those countries was coincidentally Israel. Clearly, abortion itself is a part of this global project. Such reactions by foreign states to a court ruling in a faraway country should be viewed as nonsensical. What American justices have to say about the validity of Roe v. Wade should have no bearing on the degree of morality assigned to the practice of abortion in places like France and Israel. And yet, this is the reasoning used in public statement in both countries, as if that kind of non sequitur thinking somehow made sense.